We're here tonight with three lake biologists to talk about aquatic plants in our watershed. Rob Karner, Joe Blondia, and Ron Rymick. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Rob, I understand you have some slides. What do you have for us tonight?
Yeah, I've got some visuals that I think will help really drive home some of the points we want to make tonight. And so let's get right into it with our first slide, which I will present to you now. This is a title slide that shows some of the underwater gardens that we like to think of as we go around our lakes, rivers, and streams of our watershed, the Glen Lake Crystal River watershed. And in front of me, I got plants that I call my friends. And a lot of people think, oh, those are just weeds, but really we'll talk more about what the plant does to the lake, and we're really excited about sharing that with you. So first of all, these plants provide food for animals. They provide shelter. Fish can use it for spawning and breeding habitats. It helps stabilize the soils in the bottom of a lake, and it helps purify the water. And a lot of people think of them as weeds, but that's really a plant whose virtues have yet to be discovered. My wife being a gardener, she doesn't like weeds, and it's a weed that's growing in her garden, so she wants it out. And I think a lot of people think of the lake as that's their garden, and they don't want these plants in it. They like the clear crystal waters. They like a firm sandy bottom for swimming, and they don't want any plants. But hopefully by the end of this lesson tonight, we're going to have a different feel for what these plants will do for our emotional makeup and for the ecology of the lake. The lake that is full of plants has usually got lots of fish, turtles, frogs, ducks, shorebirds, and other wildlife, and that's a big part of our watershed. This is a photograph that Laura and I, if you remember, Laura, we were out on the boat with a underwater drone, and you were steering, and what did we come up upon?
Well, a whole field of fern pondweed.
Yeah.
Seemingly miles and miles of it, big batch.
And this is on probably 18 to 20 feet of water, right?
Yeah, I think that was the east side of Big Glen.
And this is a plant called fern pondweed, as Laura was saying, and it's in its early stages of growing. So much like you see in the spring, plants are just starting to emerge out of the soil. This will eventually develop into a 6 to 8 foot long plant that you'll see growing out of the bottom of the lake and will extend up and form like a dense forest. And this is a great place for perch to hang out. So Joe, why don't you take us through the ecological benefits of aquatic plants?
Yeah, I love this picture because it's got so much in it. Aquatic plants form the base of the food chain, and they not only bring energy, but a lot of oxygen to the aquatic system. And what I like so much about this picture is that it shows the interconnection between all the different areas. It's not just the lake, but it's the uplands and the riparian areas and the shallow parts of the lake and the surface and the bottom. They all have these interconnected food webs. And at each level of a food chain, you lose about 90% of the energy as you go up the food chain. So when you see a bird like that eagle grabbing a fish, which ate another fish, which ate an insect, which ate some of the smallest plants and algae that we're talking about, there's not very much energy by the time you get to the top of that food pyramid. And that's why there are so many fewer eagles than there are bass, and there are fewer bass than there are minnows. But you've got to have a lot of plants at the bottom of that system to support and be the base of that food chain. And so these plants really add to the biodiversity of our lakes and streams.
Yeah, I like that. Well said.
Interesting.
So when you think of aquatic plants, you can put lakes into two categories. The first is an algae-dominated lake. This is when the water typically looks green. You don't have good visibility. There's so much algae that the water looks cloudy green. And there aren't many aquatic plants because the algae dominate at the top of the water column, and they literally take all the sunlight away from the aquatic plants below. And there's a case where if you have fish in this kind of a lake, they have poor eyesight typically, and they find their food by smelling and touching around. Examples would be the bullheads. They have these little whiskers, and carp, and they will forage for food, but they won't use their eyes to find it. And typically the plants that might be in a lake like this would be some invasives like Eurasian water milfoil and curly leaf pondweed, which we'll talk about later in the show.
You know what, Rob?
Yeah, go ahead,
throw
Ron.
in there, we collaborate closely with Dr. Hannington from the University of Alberta, and he's coming here every summer because all of the lakes in his region in Alberta, the province, are that type of lake. They're not, people don't like to swim in them. And you think, wait a minute, Canada, that's the pure water. But they just enjoy coming to our lakes because of what we have here in northern Michigan.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a lake in our watershed. It's called Tucker Lake, and when you canoe or kayak and you're not allowed to have a motorized boat, you can see that there's some rooted aquatics, the pond lily pads in the foreground. But when you get out in the middle of the lake, you're actually not able to see very far down into the water, and you can't see much because there isn't much there, and it's because the algae can get so dominated in the point where they cut off the light and you don't have the rooted aquatics. So the second kind of lake is a lake that is called a macrophyte dominated lake, macro meaning large and phyte meaning plant. And so this is where typically the water in the lake is blue. It's got great clarity. You can see typically to the bottom or very deep. And there's a lot of rooted aquatic plants. And this is a place where if you have fish, and normally these are good fishing lakes, you'll have the fish that find their food by using their eyesight. So they have really big eyes, and they include animal or fish like trout, perch, walleye, and muskie. And you have lots of plants, which we're going to talk more about. But here's an example. The pondweeds, the lilies, and the smartweed are good examples of this. So what does that lake look like? Here it is. Laura, this is one of your favorite lakes, isn't it? This is Fisher Lake. And you can always find yourself anywhere on the lake and see the bottom, right?
Beautiful clear water, very clear. Mm-hmm.
So let's move forward into the kind of the dance that you have ecologically with the plants and the nutrients. If you take either one of those two kinds of lakes we just talked about, either the algae-dominated lake or the macrophytic lake, nutrients are at a premium. The nutrients that need to be there in order for the plants to grow. So we're talking phosphorus and nitrogen. And what happens is if you pump a bunch of excess nitrogen and phosphorus into a lake, that gives the algae the green light, literally, to take over the lake and grow in such big mats that it covers the macrophytes. If you keep the nutrients at a normal and natural level, which usually in our lakes is a very low level, you can get the blue lakes that can then make sure that the lake is able to have these big plants that we're going to be talking about. So what we suggest you do if you're watching this show is to get out on the lakes. This is my wife, Barb. She's out kayaking on Tucker Lake. Take it slow, look down in the water, grab a few plants, and maybe even have an aquatic plant ID book and just take it all in. It's really a relaxing, healthy habit to learn more about your lake and especially the plants that are in the water column. And this is an example of just getting up close to a beautiful plant. Notice that the pond lily that we're talking about here is called yellow pond lily, and it's got brand new leaves. And by the midsummer, you're going to find that a lot of those leaves are all chewed up with insects. They're going to have holes in them everywhere. So this shows in the early spring with the brand new leaves and the brand new blossoms, how beautiful this can look. Joe, why don't you talk a little bit about the benefits of these aquatic plants? We've talked a little bit about it. Why don't you take it further?
Well, it's still that idea of of kind of crossover between ecosystems on the land and terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems. Food for the larger animals, lake and some of the others around. You'll find beaver lodges and the places where they've chewed down trees near the lake, and they also eat aquatic vegetation. All the other animals, the turtles, the muskrats, some of the ducks and swans, especially some of the diving ducks that migrate through. They really like the wild celery, and some of the duck species will dive down and kind of pull it up, and they'll eat one part of the wild celery, and then another duck will eat a different part of the wild celery, so as it floats. So a lot of cool back and forth between the food webs. And then the really small insects, a lot of the invertebrates and stuff that are more aquatic really depend on a lot of these plants. And then the plants provide the surface for the algae and protozoans, rotifers, a lot of bacteria to grow on.
Yeah, in fact, this is a picture just underneath the water surface. You can see that yellow line coming from the bottom up, and it looks fuzzy. And if you were to take that stem of that pond lily and squeeze it and literally milk it, and then in your hands, you could see under a microscope just a whole nother world of colonies of plants and animals that they wouldn't be there if it weren't for the stem of the water lily coming up. Ron, you took a class at the University of Michigan. Remember that? Freshwater phycology. And we had to go out and collect a whole bunch of algae and display it for Rex Lau, our professor.
Yeah.
Do you remember taking pond lily stems and milking them, putting them in a sack?
I do. And you get literally hundreds of different types of algae. That's a crazy number.
Diatoms and all kinds of things that you would not find anywhere else. Laura's one of the people who likes to swim around under the lily pads. Laura, what's going on here?
So under the lily pads is some of the finest snorkeling around. We're in Big Fisher here under the lily pads, and I have one of the underwater cameras and just laid on my back and looked up into the sky and took a picture here. So that's the underside of some of the lily pads. Some of them are green and some of them are this beautiful magenta color, which is very striking, especially with the sun coming through. It's like an enchanted forest under there, really. And the plants are very soft, and there's nothing down there that can hurt you. And it's just really like another world.
I see you have a little bit of an artistic flair here. This is not only a good specimen shot, but an artistic one as well. Good job.
Thank you.
So if you think about it on land, you go to a swamp and you'll find cedars, trees, and if you go up on the dunes, you'll find dune grass. And if you go on a meadow, you might find an old oak tree growing out in the middle. And you go to the highlands around Miller Hill and some of the areas around our Glen Lake, and you'll see beech trees. So each habitat on land has different plant communities. And it's the same thing with aquatic plants. If you go in the deep water, you're going to find large leaf pondweed, fern pondweed. You go in the shallow waters, you're going to find a lot of water lilies and smartweed. And we'll talk about each one of these as we move through the lesson. But in quiet waters, you see duckweed, and marl lakes like the Fishers, you're going to see a lot of chara. And in acid lakes, you're going to find bladderwort. And in streams, you're going to find some wild celery as well as other places. So let's just take a look at these. So if I said to you, hey, Joe, I just picked up this plant, it's called bladderwort, you could probably tell me where I got it, right?
Well, from a water source that's poor in nitrogen.
Yeah. And how does that work? Well, we've got these little things that look like seeds on the plant. They're called bladders. And they actually are little traps where they can have microscopic animals that swim inside the bladder, and then they get caught in it. And then the plant actually digests the animals. So this is what you'd call a carnivorous plant. And they actually, when they digest the animal, they get the nitrogen from the proteins in the insect. or whatever they're catching, and then they make up for the lack of the nitrogen or the phosphorus in the water. Here's another example. If I said to you, Ron, here's a bunch of duckweed, would you say that was from the open waters of Glen Lake, or would you say that was in a small, quiet pond?
Yeah, small quiet pond, and this is really another cool plant. People don't think of it. Smallest flowering plant in the world.
Yes.
Wow.
Just a really amazing, very proliferative plant.
And it's called duckweed for a reason, right, Joe?
I believe so.
Yeah,
Self-explanatory.
ducks, like mallards, they like to eat this stuff. It's their salad. Here we have a plant called Cara, and once again, Laura, you were the pilot for the underwater drone. I think you took this picture. It's safe to say that this was Cara growing in what kind of bottom lake? Would it have been a brown detritus lake or a marl lake?
A marl lake, like
Yeah.
little fisher or big fisher,
Yep.
just covered with this.
And one of the interesting things about the Cara, not only does it like limestone or, excuse me, marl bottoms, but it also covers the bottom, as Laura was saying, and that prevents a lot of invasive species from getting a foothold. Because if you have a dominated lake bottom with Cara, you're not going to get Eurasian water milfoil, you're not going to get some of these other problematic plants. So it's kind of like a safety for the plant to take so much cover of the bottom that other plants can't get a root, and it helps prevent invasive species from moving in. This is another.
That's really a great thing for some people to hear that might want to remove the plants from the lake.
Yeah, exactly.
That you're exposing the lake to risk of invasives.
You're as we think of in the virus climate that we're in now with COVID, that you're reducing the immunity of a lake getting infected with an aquatic.
You know, another cool thing about these is this is if I'm not mistaken, this is an algae. It's not a plant. It's an algae, macrophytic algae.
Yep, and it actually looks like a vascular plant or a rooted aquatic, but it's you're right, it's an algae, and it's one of the few that actually precipitates the excuse me, the calcium carbonate out of the water.
So you're saying it doesn't have roots?
It does not have any true stems, roots, or leaves, and no flowers, fruits, or seeds.
Because it feels like it has roots when we pull it up when we're getting samples on the Discovery boat.
Yeah, if we think
There's
of
some
them,
resistance.
Go ahead.
No, there's just some resistance of some sort. You know, I always thought it had roots.
No, it doesn't. If anything, it has root-like structures called rhizoids.
Mm.
Hey, Joe, we belong to the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. It's a statewide program. One of the parts of the program is taking a lake like we see here, and what's going on with this throwing of an iron rake in the water?
Well, that is a plant sampling device. Couple of rakes banded together, tied to a long rope, and you go out to the same areas of a lake each year and throw it to very specific locations and pull it back along the bottom. And it's a way of getting plant samples without getting into the lake.
And so they keep accurate records of what species they collect, right?
Yep.
And everybody in the state, there's probably 50 or 60 lakes that do this exact same thing in the same way with the same kind of rake. And we all compare our lakes to each other and find out what is going on in the aquatic plant world across the state. It's a very important program. But we at Glen Lake Association take it another step further. Not only we do the rake toss, but we also do underwater drone surveillance and surveys. And so this is an example of a drone that's moving through the water with headlights. This is a little quick stop video of how it travels around, remote control. And You can take photographs. You see the camera in the middle between the two headlights, and it allows you to catalog what's in a given area. Here you can see it going to the bottom, getting up close look at a broadleaf potamogeton. And there's some celery. So we also go into Fisher Lake and look for things called coontail. You can see it in the camera view. And it swims along and looks for things that might be close relatives of the Eurasian water milfoil. In this case, we didn't find any of that. We only found native milfoil, which is good. So Laura, when we go out and we not only do the rake toss and we do the underwater drone, what else do we do?
So on the warmest days of the summer, we go out and snorkel the aquatic gardens in Big and Little Glen and Big and Little Fisher on the hottest days of the year. When the water's warm, yesterday would have been a good day temperature-wise, but the water is still quite cold. So, because we're in there for a couple hours in some nice gardens, some people call them weed beds, and then we jump in and we see what we can find down there, and hopefully we know the name of everything that we're looking at. And there's nothing unusual down there, no invasives. So we'll get down there up close and personal. We also take some video footage and still shots. This is Tamarack Cove. And when we go out on the Discovery boat, we often park here and one of us jumps in and picks as many different aquatic plants as we can find. Here's Rob jumping in on off the Discovery boat, and he's going to dive down to the bottom of Big Fisher here and see what he can find. And then he's going to bring them up and talk about them and explain what each one is and show everybody the different features, and they can see that we're touching them, that they're safe, that they have really allows people who kind of have a fear of plants to have a new appreciation for them.
Okay, Ron, I'm going to put you on the spot. Take a close look at this frame here. This was a still image from a snorkel hike. How many different plants do you see here? How many species would you say? 20, 50, 4, 1?
I'm seeing 3 or 4. 4 for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's name them.
Yeah, let's name them.
Yeah,
I'll start it out. We'll
go ahead.
alternate. I got Kara.
Yeah.
Kara.
Kara. Okay. What else do you see?
Pondweed, potamogeton.
Yeah.
McGeaton.
The big leafy one that looks dominant in there.
Vallisneria.
Okay. The wild celery is another name for that.
Is that Elodia that I see or not?
Yes, in the foreground, there's some Elodia down in the bottom edge of the frame, slightly to the right. There's bushy pondweed. If you look at this picture on the lower left corner, there's a little sprig of bushy pondweed.
Yeah.
So we're going to go through and pretend like all these plants are in front of us in a tray, and we're going to go through them very quickly. So hang on to your hats. Here we go. So what we might find is a floating aquatic smartweed. You might find Kara. We've already talked about that it's really not a rooted aquatic, but it's an algae, but it looks like that. We got Elodia is another one that grows around our shorelines, and it's also closely related to an invasive. So stay tuned to what this looks like. Slightly different, but a problematic plant. Here's the wild celery, and it's sort of early springtime green, and this will actually turn to burgundy as you go through the seasons. Here we have sago pondweed, which looks kind of stringy and grass-like. We talked about the fern pondweed in the beginning of the show. This is what it looks like as it gets bigger and unfolds these beautiful fronds. Looks like a fern, so they call it fern pondweed. We have a very beautiful plant that has colorful leaves. This is the clasping pondweed. Joe, when you see this plant, when you hear the word clasping leaf, what are we talking about, do you think?
I'm assuming we're talking about the base of the leaf kind of
Yeah.
curling around the stem of the plant.
Yeah, almost like a handshake.
Mhm.
Here's a floating leaf pondweed. This tends to grow in our lake, but never really gets to the point where the leaves float on the surface because there's not enough nutrients in Big Glen. But you can see the early growth of this in the underwater view as you snorkel over these plants. This was the one that I think, Ron, you picked out, the broadleaf potamogeton or pondweed. This one's really easy to find in the samples. Then there's the grass leaf potamogeton or pondweed. And then we have the large leaf pondweed. This actually floats, looks a lot like a lily pad, but it's not. And then here's the water stargrass, which is not very common in our watershed. Looks a lot like sago pondweed. And this just points out to the whole notion that when you look at aquatic plants, there's a lot of lookalikes. So it really takes some time and energy, often the needing to see the blossom before you can really positively identify it. This is our famous coon tail. Looks like a tail on a raccoon. And you have native coon tail, and there's a lot of other plants that look similar to this. Here's some floating pondweed. And then with the white fragrant water lily, this is the most beautiful, treasured, probably most photographed aquatic plant on the planet. It's just beautiful. And then I talked about earlier the yellow pond lily that grows in the quiet waters of Tucker Lake and other places. And then this is a bed of carob, but there's something growing across the diagonal of this frame. This is the freshwater sponge of the genus Spongilla, and it's green, so you might think, well, that's an aquatic plant, and but it's actually an animal that is able to have this algae growing inside its skin, and you can see through the skin, and then when you see through the skin and you see the green balls of algae, it gives it the overall green color, and it's mistaken often for a plant, but it's actually an animal. And it's one of the only species of freshwater sponges on the planet. Most of the sponges of the world are in the oceans. Tons and tons of species there, but in the freshwater environments, especially in northern Michigan, you have the one species. So invasives. Joe, you know about invasives because you've heard about them, but have you ever seen any in Glen Lake? Any Eurasian water milfoil that you know of?
Fortunately, none that I know of.
Yeah, what's the consequences of finding it?
Well, I think they would displace a lot of our native plants and disrupt a lot of those food chains. And sometimes the big thing with invasives is they often they don't have very much competition. They don't have any natural predators, and they just grow unchecked.
Yep. So here's a lake that looks like that. Do we have any lakes like this around here? This is what Lime Lake looks like, right, Ron, or no?
Fortunately, no. Fortunately, no. But you know, South Lake Linall just last year discovered they had it, and you know, just to alarmingly, 13 out of the 15 sites that they sampled with that rake showed positive, and they're doing $100,000+ project just this year to try to curb it because it could turn into this.
Yep.
You wouldn't even be able to run boats through there.
Yep.
How are they trying to remedy the situation?
They're going to do that with what's called DASH, diver assisted suction. I forget what the H stands for, but harvest, yeah. And so they're going to actually, they go down and suction it out. So they don't put chemicals in the water that way.
Wow.
And they try to get every fragment that breaks, because if any fragment breaks and escapes the suction, you're really multiplying this and making it a worse problem.
Right. Best thing, prevent it.
Yep. Not only prevent it, but if you find it, early detection will save you hundreds of thousands of dollars. This actually could take all the money that the Glen Lake Association has in their reserves, and it would bankrupt us in 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Another invasive, this is curly leaf pondweed. In fact, we just had a crew go out on Brooks Lake, one of our satellite lakes in our watershed today, Mike Litch and Bill Meserve, and they actually went out with a special cutting rake, and they cut off at the stem all of the curly leaf and gathered it up into nets and took it off the lake, and hopefully that will keep it abated for the next few years, and we'll have to probably manage it again. But it's something that we, out of all the lakes that we have, Mill Pond, Tucker Lake, Brooks Lake, Fisher Lakes, Glen Lake, both big and little, we don't have any of it anywhere except that one spot. So taking it out early actually makes a lot of sense. And this is what it looks like. So if you see this, make sure you give us a call and contact us. And another one.
How does this spread then?
Boy, that's a
Could
good
it spread
question.
into Big Glen?
Is it in Big Glen, or could it get into Big Glen?
Could it, if it's in
Yes.
Brooks, or yeah, Brooks Lake?
It's actually been in Big Glen, and we've taken it out once back about
Okay.
10 years ago with a summer school class in biology at the Leelanau School. We had 6 or 7 kids come out with a fish seine that was 20 feet long by 4 feet high, and we set up a barrier so that when we harvested it off the bottom of the lake, we got all the fragments out with a rake, and then we took the seine and cleared the water, and we had about 5 wheelbarrow loads full that we hauled away and composted far away from the shoreline. And thanks to the Leelanau School kids, we don't have this growing back in our lake. It was over by the Narrows, just north of the Narrows, moving north on the Big Glen side. What a success story, huh?
Mm-hmm. Good community service.
Yeah. Frog bit isn't in our lake yet. This is one of the things that we're hopeful we can keep out of our lake, and it's in a lot of other lakes. You can see in the background how it can be like Eurasian water milfoil. It'll just take over. And another one that really is not so problematic in Michigan, but it is in other lakes, and it may come up here if somebody's hauling a lake from Missouri or Tennessee and they got it on their trailer or in their boat. This could really rapid fire into an explosion of hydrilla. It's mostly in the southern states of Florida and Alabama and Mississippi, Georgia. Those are the places where this can really go rampant. And the one plant that we don't have yet, or maybe we do, but it's not as problematic, is, and it looks a lot like Cara, but it's starry stonewort. And it is one of those plants that can get out, it can outcompete the native Cara and just take over the bottom of a lake. So what do we do to try to prevent the spread of invasive plants? We have this boat wash station that the Glen Lake Association monitors and staffs and pays for. It's about $30,000 a year. Every boat that comes through gets to a checkpoint. There's an interview process. Where's your boat been? How long has it been out of the water? Let's flush your engine. Let's flush the tanks that are in the boat, like the fishing bait tanks, and make sure that this boat doesn't bring in any invaders that we can't afford to get rid of later. And it's really one of our best strategies. I will say that the Glen Lake Association had a generous donation from a family foundation, the Trulask Family Foundation, and they, together with the Glen Lake Association, covered 3 years of operation to the tune of $90,000 to keep this place up and running, and it's fully staffed, and it's the only place really where you can launch a boat. So that really helps us with the invasive species program. I'm going to stop sharing any slides because I don't have any more, but I'm sure there might be a question or two from our group, and wondering if anybody wants to chime in with any other comments, thoughts, questions.
I don't have a question. I do have a comment, though. I had the pleasure last year of joining you folks on your discovery boat, and very educational. I know this year it's going to be, curtailed because of the pandemic, but that's a great thing that your lake association does, and you guys specifically. It's very educational, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's our discovery boat program is I think in the 8th or 9th year of running. And just this past year, we had a very generous donation from a family that heard about Discovery Boat, but it hasn't even been on a cruise yet. But they gave us a six-figure donation that'll make sure that Discovery Boat keeps going for years to come. So Laura, would you like to close out this lesson with any parting thoughts or a farewell?
Well, thank you, Rob, Joe, and Ron, for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. It was very fascinating. Good to know what's in our lake and that everything is being monitored carefully and that we're on top of it.
Excellent.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you all. And stay tuned for some more lessons on other topics regarding Discovery Boat. So see you all the next time.